Well, thank you so much, Gila. And Gila and I have something in common today. We are both, even though my background is Tarnell, and we are all going there together on this group tour, live and interactive. We are both actually physically in Israel today. So Gila is in Tel Aviv, I'm in Ashkelon. And these are interesting times in Israel, I can tell you. But we are all going to be going with Olga in just a minute, who I will introduce to you in Tarnell. But before we do, I know some of you are anticipating going to Istanbul today. Well, the world is a funny place. And in Istanbul, starting in the beginning of September, there is political unrest. You may have read about quite a lot of what's going on there. And although Catherine and I had planned to go with Emmy, who is our Jewish heritage guide, over in Balat, the old Jewish neighborhood, and we had arranged with a couple of synagogues, which we still hope to take you to. They have now shut down the internet politically in all of Istanbul, and we tried different ways around it, but we felt that it might be too unstable to bring. So fortunately, we are now bringing you our most popular Jewish heritage tours. We've been doing this for 5 years, both with the Scholars Program as well as a number of other Jewish heritage programs and museums. And of all the ones, I can tell you that today is really quite a treat. We were very fortunate that Olga was able to fill in. And just a bit about this, we are going to Tarnów, Poland. We do know that many of you may have connections there. I mentioned it's not only live stream, but you may also know that it is interactive, which means that we want to get your real-time questions. It'll be moderated by me, and I will see them. And then at the appropriate times, I'll be able to pass them along to Olga, incredibly knowledgeable. Also, some of you may also have some background in it, but for those who don't, and as Gila said, you will be getting the full trip kit that has 10 pages of lots of in-depth, immersive information in it. But in Tarnów, Poland, it's a town that what once was known as the cultural heart of Galicia. Before World War II, nearly half of Tarnów's population, about 25,000 people, were Jewish. Half. It was one of the largest Jewish communities at that time. And the community here built synagogues, schools, a vibrant marketplace, and one of the largest cemeteries in all of Poland. Jewish life was woven into every corner of this town, which makes it so special for all of us who are deeply interested in Jewish heritage. But Tarnów is also tragically significant because on June 14th, 1940, it became the site of the very first mass deportation to Auschwitz. That transport of prisoners, many of them Jews at that time, marked a devastating turning point in Nazi policy. And to this day, a plaque at the railway station bears witness to that moment. And one of the most haunting and powerful reminders still standing is the stone bimah. It's the pulpit of the Great Synagogue, which the Nazis destroyed in 1939. And although the synagogue itself is very sadly gone, the bimah remains in the center of Tarnów, an open-air memorial to the once thriving Jewish community. So standing there, we're all going to feel the silence of what was lost and the resilience of what remains, which, by the way, makes it even more poignant what is happening in Israel today. That's why we've chosen Tarnów for today's tour. It's not only a place of memory and loss, but also of connection and responsibility to remember, to honor, and to share these stories with all of the generations. So I mentioned that we are especially fortunate to be guided today by Olga, which is one of Wowzitude's most knowledgeable Jewish heritage guides. We actually do Jewish heritage in over 100 destinations, so this is quite special. Some of you may know Olga from the very start, when we did programs in Odessa. She did our Jewish heritage tours in Odessa. But since the war in Ukraine, she now makes her home between Poland and Germany and really does incredible amounts of research in each of the towns and cities that we go to in both countries. So her expertise and deep dedication to bring Jewish history to life in both scholarship and spirit. And she does incredible live stream tours, but she also does incredible in-person tours, and I know firsthand, she's amazing. So today, as we walk Tarnów streets and reflected its memorials, we'll step into the lives of those who came before us. And we always need to know the richness of Jewish heritage, the devastation of its loss, and the enduring power of remembrance. And with that, I want to welcome Olga, who will take us there live, and again, encourage you to ask questions all along the way. Welcome, Olga.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Susan, for such an introduction. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us here in Tarnów in eastern Poland, in the region which once was known as Galicia. And I suggest we start the tour with a map. Catherine, if you can help me, please, with the map, just to get an idea where we are. We are not far from Krakow. So on the map, Krakow is highlighted with the heart. That's what usually my Google Maps do. So that's where Krakow is, where you see the heart. We are where you see the blue and red dots. It takes about 45 minutes by train to get here. And further to the right are Rzeszów, Przemyśl, and these are the towns which are located closer to the border between Poland and Ukraine. So in the 19th century, and pretty much up until the time when Poland regained its statehood in 1918, this region was known as Galicia. And that was the time when Poland as a country was partitioned, and this part of the country was part of the Austrian Empire. So thank you, Catherine. But let's start our exploration with the town's early period. So, and we're here in the heart of the old town, actually on the border of the old town. When the town was just founded in the 14th century, here was the moat. It was right outside the town's wall. So according to the historians and archaeologists, in 1330, one of the early kings of Poland presented a village, which was here, to a nobleman who provided him with a great service. And that nobleman, by the name Spisimir Lilivita, started building a town on top of the hill, 900 feet above the sea level. We are not sure, our historians are not sure when the Jews settled here, but they assume that they arrived here in the early 1400s, because already around that time, the town was fairly large, and it was located on an important regional trading route which connected Krakow and Lvov. Today, Lviv is the biggest town in Western Ukraine. And historians say, they assume, that the early Jewish settlers settled here in the eastern part of the town, which of course at that time looked very different. Outside the moat, somewhere there, in the eastern part of the town, right outside the town wall. And here is one of the few remaining fragments of the medieval town wall, which once encircled Tarnów. So the name of that noble family who received that village from the King of Poland as a gift was Tarnów, or Tarnowski. And that explains the name of the town, Tarnów. And for about 400 years, many generations of this family owned Tarnów up until the country's partition in 1780s. So the life in this town for centuries was governed, was managed by its owners, that noble Polish family. According to the historians, in the second half of the 15th century, the Jews were allowed by the town owners, that noble Polish family, to move inside the town wall and to build there 15 houses. And now we are following in the footsteps of those early Jewish settlers and getting inside the old town wall into the area which became known as the medieval Jewish quarter. And some of the houses here lasted till our days. These were the ones which were built in the 16th century, like this one. In fact, if you ever Google Tarnów, you'll get this image right away. It's one of the most known images associated with Tarnów's Jewish heritage. This building belongs to the 16th century, and that's one of the medieval arches. So that's where the Jews settled. They were allowed to build 15 houses in the designated area. And that area later became known as Jewish Street, or in Polish, ulica Żydowska. And here we are on Jewish Street. That's the street sign, which says ulica Żydowska. And this is one of the oldest houses on this street, but please keep it in mind that in the Middle Ages, the street level was much lower. And still today, the shop windows, the bars of the shop windows, some of the signs of the stores resemble the look of the windows of the Jewish shops and the Jewish signs, which were here in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century. Of course, not during the Middle Ages, but in the early 20th century. And it's done on purpose to preserve the Jewish vibe, the Jewish atmosphere, the Jewish heritage of this place. And if you look at this lane from this perspective, it's another most known image of Tarnów. Just to give you one example, here is the shop sign, which is barely readable even when it's light, but it has the sign in Polish and in Yiddish, which says second-hand or used clothes store. In the old days, at least in the 19th and early 20th century, there were the bars on the windows for safety reasons. Today, these bars are here to preserve that heritage, to emphasize the fact that some hundred years ago, the windows of the Jewish shops look this way. And up until the most recent renovations carried out here, one could find traces of the mezuzahs at the door portals, but not any longer. That's gone because of the recent renovations. So in the second half of the 15th century, the Jews were allowed to move inside the city wall and to build here in the eastern part of the town 15 houses. And that's where they continued living for several centuries. The Jewish community was growing, but the number of the houses was not increasing. Gradually, the buildings were getting higher and higher. They were getting more and more cramped. And in the at the end of the 17th century, there were about 200 Jews living here within the limits of this one street in the 15 houses. According to the knowledge of the historians, Here they built the first synagogue, and most probably that first synagogue was built of wood. And only in the early 17th century, it was replaced with a stone building. And those Jews who were living here around that time were mostly moneylenders and merchants, traders. So the first wooden synagogue was built there. In the early 16th century, it was replaced with the stone one. And the stone one was there up until 1939, up until the Nazi occupation. Today, only that bimah is there, and that's the only artifact, the only structure, the only part of the synagogue which lasted till today. So the entrance sign says, remnants of magnificent 17th century synagogue destroyed by Germans. The old synagogue square. And the bimah, which is for the preservation purposes, has gotten this top. And another sign, which says the bimah is the only remnant of the magnificent old synagogue of Tarnów destroyed by the Germans in November 1939.
So Olga, we have a question from David, and he's saying, this bimah is so powerful to see. Why do you think the Nazis destroyed the synagogue, but left the bimah standing?
Let me show you a couple of photographs. We're going to get to the tree, but closer to the end of the tour. We're now in the Middle Ages. That's how the synagogue looked in 1930s, so before the Nazi occupation. It was indeed getting quite old, but it was still there. That's the synagogue in November 1939. So the building was not completely destroyed. Parts of the wall, like the one in the back there, are missing. The bimah is still there. The walls are here. The roof is there. So the Nazis destroyed the interior completely, and that was the case in pretty much on all of the occupied by the Nazis territories. But it's not that they destroyed all of the building and just left the bimah. No, they destroyed the interiors, and then most probably the walls and the roof had fallen apart by the end of the war or in the first post-war years. So that stone synagogue built here in the early 17th century was the main and only synagogue for the Tarnów Jews, who continued living here on Żydowska, or Jewish Street, who were moneylenders and traders. And the owners of the town didn't allow them to build more than 15 houses, although the community was growing. The 17th century was a quite challenging time here in the region in general and in Tarnów. It was the time of the decline of the Polish kingdom and the time of the wars with the Swedes, a few invasions of the Tatars, but mainly with the Swedes. And when those wars ended, the economy of the town and the economy of Eastern Poland was in trouble. And that's why the town owners allowed the Jews to buy more property outside this Jewish street. A lot of space in the city, in the town, was empty. Quite a lot of people had left. Quite a lot of people had become the victims of the war. As a result, a lot of houses here were abandoned. A lot of stalls on main market square were abandoned as well. And that noble Polish family who owned the town permitted the Jews to buy houses or to buy pieces of land to build new houses. And as a result, the adjacent streets became populated by the Jews. And still today, that street in front of us, which became known as pretty much the second address for the Tarnów Jews in the 17th and early 18th century, has a very interesting name. It's called the Street of Money Exchanges, because that was one of the main trades for the local Jews. And both Jewish street and this one, which became the second street for the Tarnów Jews, still today lead to main market square, to the heart of old Tarnów, to the center of what Tarnów was back then. It was the main market square, literally the place of trade. It was packed with the stalls, and the stalls were there, and that was the center of the commercial life of the town up until the first decades of the 20th century. And from the start, the early Jewish settlers were permitted by the town owners to have here stalls. And then they got more in the 17th century. What did they trade here? Well, wine from Hungary. Tarnów had a big wine market. And from the start, the town was located on the trading route, which led west-east from Kraków to Lvov and further to Kiev. That's on one hand. And on the other hand, the second trading route, which led from the north of the country, from the Baltic Sea coastline, south towards Hungary. So wine, textile, and cloth. These were the main three goods traded here. In the backdrop is the spire of the Tarnów Cathedral, and this is the building of the town hall. So in the 18th century, because the town owners needed that, the Jews received more privileges, because basically the town owners needed more business in the town and more money. And in general, lives of the residents of these privately owned towns, particularly the Jews, depended on the privileges, on the attitude of the town owners. So, and in case of Eastern Poland, these were wealthy Polish noble families. So the owners here were quite practical. And in the 18th century, when the economy started declining, they gave Jews more privileges. The Jews were permitted to establish the guilds of craftsmen. So they were not only moneylenders or traders, they became craftsmen. So that's another view of Jewish street. That was known as Upper Jewish Street. And today it's decorated with the murals. The murals, different murals, dedicated to the Jewish guilds of craftsmen. So this is a baker. Shoemaker. Blacksmith. Clockmaker. Weaver. And of course, tailor. And those murals are called the Gallery of Craftsmen. So the Jewish guilds, craftsmen guilds, were established. And of course, that didn't make the Christian craftsmen happy, but they didn't have an option. So clashes would happen often in the 18th century, but there were no big pogroms because the Jews were protected by the town owners. And in the 18th century, according to the historians, most of the stores in the town, like 95%, belonged to the Jews. There were the Jewish guilds of craftsmen, and in general, the Jewish population here counted around 75%. And that's a very interesting street, which on one end has the Tarnów Cathedral, Catholic Cathedral, Roman Catholic, and on the other end, it has bimah. So in the old days, it led to the synagogue. So it literally connected the old synagogue with the main and only cathedral. And this Jewish quarter was not fenced off pretty much up until 1939. So it really
Olga,
shows. Yep.
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to pause here before we go too far because there's a few very, very important questions that I want to surface. Arnold would like to know who created the murals that we just saw representing the Jewish craftsmen, and I'll add when was that created? And also, one of the members is asking, were they specifically Jewish guilds of craftsmen? Were they only Jews, or were they part of a larger guild? So when we looked at those murals, if you could tell us a bit more. And the last thing I'll just throw in while we're doing this, how much was in fact destroyed during World War II? How much of what we're seeing may have been original from the 1800s?
So everything what you're seeing is pretty much original. Tarnów was one of those small towns, which was not really, it was not really important. You know, it had some industry right before the outbreak of the Second World War. These were mainly the textile factories and the mills. There was no military industry. The Nazis didn't bomb it. They just, occupied it. They literally walked into the city. They were here around September 10. So there was no heavy bombardment at the beginning of the war or at the end. So all these houses are regional. Whatever was destroyed is gone. And that's why, for example, here, we now have this big parking lot. Originally, there were old houses which simply didn't last till our days. The gallery, the murals, were created by a special committee. There is the Jewish committee, and we're going to talk about that when we return to the square. The Jewish committee, which is part of the municipal government. And the committee was established by the local historian, who is also an ethnographist, and who has been putting quite a lot of effort, I'd say tremendous effort, in preserving the Jewish heritage of Tarnów. They started with the Jewish heritage, now also the heritage of the Roma people. So let's continue. The guilds, once the Jewish craftsmen got the permission to establish the guilds were 100% Jewish. And there were Christian guilds. And that led to, for example, two guilds of the same kind, a Christian guild of blacksmith and a Jewish guild of blacksmith. And that was the case in all of the Polish kingdom, where the Jewish craftsmen were allowed to establish their guilds in Kraków or in any other place. So separate Jewish guilds and Christian guilds. So we are in the 18th century when the Jewish community, the Jewish residents made up about 75% of the local residents. They were moneylenders, they were traders, they established the guilds of craftsmen. There were clashes, but there were no major pogroms. And then Poland was partitioned. And this region became part of the Austrian Empire. The town continued its growth, and in the early 19th century, most of the medieval wall was demolished, and the city started expanding outside the medieval quarter. The new districts were built, and the district over there became the new address for the Tarnów Jews because the community continued growing. And in 1860s, the Jews of Galicia, everywhere in Galicia, received equal rights from the Austrian rulers. And once they received equal rights, they became very active in municipal government. The business started growing, and the third quarter of the 19th century marks the second golden age of the Tarnów Jews. The first one was in the 16th century. That was the golden age of the Polish kingdom, when the economy of the Polish kingdom was at its peak, when the country was the largest in terms of geography state in Europe. And the second golden age for the Tarnów Jews here was the third quarter of the 19th century. The town was growing. The Jews were relaunching, rebuilding its textile industry. Most of the sawmills belonged to the Jews. The new districts were built, including this one. The Jews became active in municipal government everywhere in Galicia. They became members in the town hall. They were deputies of mayors, including here in Tarnów. And still today, this seat bears the name of Elias Goldhammer, who before the Second World War, in the first years of the 20th century, was the vice mayor of Tarnów. And the street begins with a sign that's a little bit of a history sign, which briefly in 3 languages highlights the history of the street. It says who Elias Goldhammer was, that he was a very respected member of the local community, not only of the Jewish community, but of the Tarnów, among the Tarnów residents in general. And that's why shortly after his death, the seat was named after him, which was really an exceptional case in Austrian Galicia. So in the early 20th century, part of this building was a prayer house. And in general, around that time, there were 40 synagogues, 40, and prayer houses in Tarnów. The building over there was a Jewish-owned hotel. The building next to it, which is beautifully illuminated, was a Jewish-owned bank. And in the building across the road, there was a Jewish-owned restaurant. That's just to give you an example. The community at that time, in the early 20th century, the Jews made up about 35% of the local residents. There were about 20,000 Jews living here. And still today, the facade of the building, the ground floor, which used to have that Jewish-owned restaurant, has a few phrases from the menu in Yiddish. So in Polish, tea, milk, and different snacks. And the same here, only without tea or milk and different snacks.
So Olga, a quick question about the remnants of the Yiddish signs as well. You've pointed them out a couple of times, And how did they manage to survive the war when the Nazis tried to erase all of Jewish life here?
They were painted over, and that was the case also everywhere. They were painted over, sometimes they were plastered over. They continued being painted over during the communist days, and usually in 1990s, early 2000s, during the restoration works, they would be uncovered. So we are now in the turn of the 20th century at Tarnów, when the Jews made up about 35% of the local residents. They were industrialists, they were wealthy, they were poor, they were middle class, they were intellectuals, they owned bank, like this one. And still today, if one can access the entrance lobby, now it's obviously closed, one will be able to see the two plaques with the names of the managers, top managers of this bank. That was the Jewish-owned hotel. They owned the mills. They relaunched the textile industry. In the Middle Ages, they were in the textile trade. In the late 19th century, they were building the textile industry here, the factories. There were liberal Orthodox Jews, and the majority of the local Jews were liberal Orthodox. There were traditional Orthodox, there were Hasidic Jews, and the Hasidic community was not homogeneous at all. It consisted of different houses, different groups, and each had a prayer house. That's why 40 synagogues and prayer houses. The Zionist movement was quite big here. In fact, according to the local records, the first Jewish settlement in Palestine was established by the Jews from Tarnów in 1890s. So finally, in the early years, in the first years of the 20th century, after quite a long period of time, the Jews raised the money to build the new synagogue. And the new synagogue was built here in this district, which became the new Jewish quarter. And once the construction works were finished, that new synagogue, Catherine, if you can help me with the picture, please. The new synagogue became the special pride of the Tarnów Jews. It was designed in Moorish style. It had a dome. That's the destroyed and the image where it was not destroyed yet.
So Olga, just a quick question as that photograph
That's
is
how it
coming up.
looked.
We had a question also, the bank building that you showed us when you talked about access. One of our members asked, can it just not be accessed because of the time of day, and what type of building, how is it used today if it was
It's used by it's used by the municipal government.
Okay,
So
it can be
yeah.
accessed, just not now at night, and its now purpose is obviously not as a Jewish bank.
No. It's occupied by the municipal government. So that's the new synagogue, which was designed in the Moorish style with a dome, as most of the synagogues at the time, which were built by the liberal Orthodox Jews. It was called the new synagogue, although officially it was called the Franz Josef Synagogue after the Austrian emperor. And it was opened on the emperor's birthday. Thank you, Catherine. It was also destroyed by the Nazis, and now we can show that other synagogue. And usually the interiors were destroyed, the walls were there. So that's how it looked after the destruction. And then the walls over time, by the end of the war, the first post-war years, they would just simply collapse. Thank you. And today on the facade of this house, and this is a post-war communist era apartment block, there is a sign which says that in this place stood the biggest synagogue called the New, and it was burned by Germans in November 1939. And the sign was placed there in September 1993.
And Olga, that leads me to a question that Mitchell has, actually two questions I'd like to surface. Are there the stumble stones in Tarnow? We've seen them before in many, many other places. So as we're seeing those plaques and memorials are the stumble stones, and perhaps you can explain what that is as well. And just to clarify for everyone, we've gone kind of day into night, or the blue hour into night. It's now 7:40, 7:45 in Tarnow. That is the live time that we're in now. So you could see day into night, but perhaps you could tell us about whether there's stumble stones or the other memorials.
I actually haven't seen the stumbling stones in any of the Polish cities I've traveled so far. We don't have them in Krakow. I haven't seen them here. I haven't seen them in Przemysl. I've been to 6 or 7 other cities in eastern Poland, which once had very vibrant Jewish communities. No, but there are usually memorial signs on the mass graves in the Jewish cemeteries, in the towns, in the places which became the areas of the mass shootings, and we're going to see one of those signs, but no stumbling stones.
So I just checked because I know you were seeing if you had seen it, and just to clarify, there are none, Mitchell and group. The project hasn't been implemented here yet. There's no, terrible reason for it. But what the town has done is created, as Olga just said, its own way of marking the memory. And they have something called the Trail of the Forgotten, which is a different project. It's at street level memorial stones, but the stumble stones that we're familiar with, sometimes called Stolperstein. This is an artist who's been doing it over parts of Germany and the Czech Republic. We've seen it there, certainly in Berlin and in Prague, but it just hasn't gotten here yet. So
it hasn't gotten here yet. It's an international project these days, and the first stumbling stones, those metal plaques, square plaques with the names, the dates, the name of the concentration camp, and the date of the deportation, the first ones outside Europe were placed in Buenos Aires a few years ago. They are not in Eastern Europe yet, and not in Poland, because please keep it in mind that those stumbling stones, which are usually placed on the sidewalks in front of the last address of a Jewish resident who either immigrated, was deported, was murdered, had to flee, committed suicide. Sometimes they're placed at the last working address of a Jewish resident. They are usually privately owned, and oftentimes they are owned by people, individuals, who do research of their apartment block, and they find out that once a Jewish person lived there and they want to put the sign and they pay €200, they prove with the research that the person lived there, and that's how it's happening. Sometimes they are financed by different organizations, charity funds, but mainly by individuals. And that's quite costly for a lot of people in Eastern Europe. And that's why here, those commemorative projects are usually carried out by different organizations, historians, with the support of the government, and they just take a different shape, different form. So we finished the history story at the new synagogue, which was designed in the Moorish style and which was destroyed by the Nazis. The mikvah, which was built around the same time as the new synagogue in the first decade of the 20th century, in the same Moorish style, lasted till our day. And you are looking at the mikvah, built here in Tarnów in the first decade of the 20th century, in the Moorish style. Look at the size of the building. And it was funded by the community, of course, with the donations of the community members. It had cold water pools, hot water pools, changing rooms, place to socialize. So the whole building was occupied by mikvah up until 1939. After the end of the Second World War, it was a communal, basically communal bathhouse for all residents of Tarnów. That it was a small, not a resort, but a medical treatment facility where people could take different healing baths. And then in 1980s, it just became a commercial building with different offices. We can stick our camera in. Once it had the Jewish restaurant, in 2022, it got closed. Today, it's just an office building. See?
So Olga, we've had a couple of questions also about the community today as well. Is there any community in Tarnow today, a Jewish community there? And also there is a question from Robert about whether there's enough support or where the support today comes from in Tarnow to support the synagogue, to support these the preservation of these buildings, particularly because obviously the Nazis used them as something else if they still existed and weren't destroyed by them. So who's supporting them today, and is there even a community today?
There is no community, and in most of these towns in eastern Poland, which once had big and vibrant Jewish communities, which made up about half of the local residents, the communities were not reestablished. Because of the hostile environment after the war, because of just a few survivors, because of the communist regime and declining economy. So those Jews who survived, and we're going to talk about the survivors a little bit at the end of the tour, if they returned, they would see what's going on here, and they would either move to bigger cities like Krakow, Warsaw, Wrocław, and stay there, or they would immigrate to wherever it was possible to immigrate, Israel or the United States. In most of the cases, sometimes London, it depended. So the community was never reestablished. So today, all of these projects to preserve Jewish heritage are either privately funded by different international, mainly American, Jewish foundations, which I believe were established by the descendants of the survivors from this region, or even from Tarnów, or there are quite a few projects which are funded by the government. Because thanks to the efforts of one man, that historian and ethnographist, they established here a Jewish committee within the municipal government, which is responsible for the preservation and research. And that committee and the projects are funded by the municipal government. So back to history. Across the road from the mikvah, there is this monument, which was placed there after the Second World War. It has the sign saying that from here, 728 Poles, residents of Tarnów, were deported with the first transport to Auschwitz on June 14, 1940. And this was the first sort of major operation which was carried out by the Nazis after they occupied the town. So the Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and around September 10th, they were here. While they were approaching during the first days of the war, about 1/3 of the local Jews fled eastward towards what at that time was eastern Ukraine, to Lvov and surroundings. However, on September 17, that area was occupied by the Soviets. Some stayed there, and that saved their lives. A few returned, but mostly they stayed there. So when the town was occupied, among the first things that the Nazis did, was arresting intellectuals, intelligentsia, top clergy in every town, city, or even a village. These were usually non-Jewish Polish residents of those places who were teachers and directors of schools, so the city's elite. That's how the Nazis trying to eliminate any possible opposition. And that was happening all over the occupied territory. So 728 men, or people, who were mostly non-Jews, but among them were a few dozens of Jews who were the school teachers and directors who belonged to the city's intellectual elite. And they were arrested together with the elite, not because they were the Jews. They were arrested and brought to this building where they were kept for a short period of time. And from here, they were walked to the train station and deported to Auschwitz. And that was the first transport to Auschwitz. And we're now on the square, which is called the Victims of Auschwitz Square. And besides that memorial, there is a telephone booth right here, which says the first transport to Auschwitz. Inside the booth is the complete list of names of those deported. And then if you dial a certain combination of numbers, this phone, you get to hear brief history about the Nazi occupation of Tarnów and about that first transport.
So I think we also have a video of the memorial as well. I know that we had several questions about memorials coming up there, and perhaps we can show that now, Catherine. So this is also during the day, and I know you filmed this earlier.
Yeah, I filmed that in July, and we are now on the city's outskirts at the new Jewish cemetery, which is about 20-minute walk from where we are right now. The cemetery is gated. The original gate, which lasted till our days, was presented by Lech Walesa to the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. It's closed. So now what I'm doing, I'm sticking my camera through the gate to film the territory. And at the front of the cemetery are several big mass graves. In 1942, thousands of Jews were executed, were shot down at the cemetery. After the war, one of the Jewish survivors, who was one of those who fled eastward and ended up being on the Soviet territory, and that's why he survived the war, returned to Tarnów to find out that his family was murdered by the Nazis. And he created this memorial, which is actually a pillar, or part of the pillar, of the new synagogue, which they found in the rubble. Today, the cemetery is maintained on the donations of several Jewish foundations and on some municipal money. And where you see this grass lawn, that's a mass grave at the front. There are about 6,000 graves there, and everything has been recorded, documented, so very easy to do research if needed. And the cemetery is about 20-minute walk from here, fast pace. So that first transport to Auschwitz was the first big operation which the Nazis carried out here. In 1941, they ordered all of the Tarnów Jews to move into one area, and that was the area of the medieval Jewish quarter. And about 20,000, the numbers vary, but about 20,000 of Tarnów Jews moved into the streets of the medieval Jewish quarter. Why there? Because it was fairly easy to separate the Jews there. The quarter still had that medieval wall on one side. And a year later, in June 1942, when the Nazis decided to wall it off, they simply built the wooden fence to separate it from the rest of the old town. The fence was 9 meters, about 3 feet, 9 feet, about 3 meters high, and was barbed wire. And there was one gate. And all of the town of Jews and the Jews from the suburbs ended up being in the ghetto here, about 40,000 of them. And shortly afterwards, there was the first execution, they called it Operation, Action, against the ghetto's residents. Mass shootings on the streets, on Jewish street over there, on the adjacent street. According to the memoirs of those who survived, the blood was flooding towards the main market square. Several thousand more were shot on the territory of the cemetery. That's why you've just seen the memorial there on top of the mass grave. Several thousand more in the forest in the suburbs. And then more were deported to the concentration camp in Delchak, which became one big graveyard for the Polish Jews. So basically, as a result of that first operation or action, half of the ghetto residents were murdered. About 20,000 continued being there. Then there were 4 more operations, 3 until the end of 1942 and 1 in 1943. The ghetto, which was pretty much here on the territory of the old Jewish quarter, was liquidated at the end of 1943. A few survived, and among the survivors were the ghetto residents who were the Jewish forced laborers for the Hugo Boss factory. The same Hugo Boss factory, which was in Kraków, had a division here. Julius Madrich, who managed the Hugo Boss factory, took him out of the ghetto here and sent to Kraków, later to Plaszów. A few survived in hiding, being hidden by the locals. A few survived with the fake documents. This tree is part of the project to preserve the heritage and to commemorate the memories of the Jews on one hand and the memories of the Gentile who saved the Jews. The trunk of the tree has the plaques with the names of the non-Jewish residents of Tarnów who saved the Jews. And once you get closer to the tree trunk, you can hear the sound of the heartbeat.
So Olga, very, very poignant. And I want to actually ask 2 questions kind of fused together. Linda's asking, so what is actually in the Jewish Heritage Center that we're seeing here, that we're walking past? Who visits it? And since the name is clearly in English, do Poles visit it, school groups, tourists? Who's the audience for that? And I'll just conflate that also with Deborah's question, which is, so today, how is the Jewish community viewed? And is this, in fact, the ways that Tarnow and the whole area is, in fact, remembering Jewish history to honor that history? Who's behind this, I guess, and who's the audience?
Okay, behind this Jewish Heritage Center is a local historian, non-Jew, but a citizen of Tarnów, who decided that the town had to preserve the Jewish heritage. First, he started with the Jewish heritage. Then he moved on to the Roma, the Sinti heritage. He was joined by a few other non-Jews, residents of this town. They are professors of the local university, the teachers, who basically lobbied the municipal government to establish the special Jewish Heritage Committee within the Jewish government. They got the government funds. And over there is a big poster with the country's emblem and the flag. And the poster says that this area is maintained on the government money. And you see the amount, the numbers. They opened this Jewish Heritage Center, which is basically the only place where you can obtain, where you can get some info, the maps, about the maps with the Jewish route of the old town. They're gonna release the first brief guidebook of the Jewish heritage of Tarnów at the end of the year. They already released one, but in Polish. They're gonna do that in English. They started organizing. They are behind this exhibit. And they've been doing a special event, and hopefully we'll be able to attend it next year. In June, they have a festival dedicated to the Jewish heritage of Galicia. So all that is done thanks to the efforts of one group of people who just decided that Tarnów had to preserve its Jewish heritage. These are the places that we visited: Main Market Square. We've started at this lane. I'm sure you remember. That's another photograph of this lane. In 1891, the Grossbart family, the Zomar family, synagogues, which we've seen these photographs, and the dome of the new synagogue, which defined the city skyline for about 30 years. So the Heritage Center is basically an office where one can go when it's open to get some map, to put for some inquiry, just basically right now to get some map. But that's the office of people who organize Galicia Jewish Heritage Festival, which is carried out here. That's where this becomes the venue of the festival, and who have been putting a lot of efforts to preserve the Jewish heritage. Now, another interesting project. Look at that building. Once we get closer, you're going to see the side. So these are a few medieval, renovated, restored mansions turned into one big house. The sign says Cenotaphium Jiddische Hut, Jewish house, Cenotaphium. So it's another private project which was initiated by an Italian. They are now looking to attract more money to finish the interior. It's not really a museum or a memorial. No, it's meant to have a space inside where they're going to recreate 3 Jewish homes typical of these regions, where one could see the Jewish lifestyle typical of this region. And it's meant to preserve the heritage, not only of Tarnów, but of this region in general. Now they are awaiting, and those murals, which we've seen earlier, are on the ground floor. Now they are waiting for more money. And that sign says the following. Let me read it out because it's getting dark. It's dark and barely visible. So the inhabitants of these houses were among the 40,000 Tarnovians slaughtered by the German murderers during the horrific years of the Bastille aggression. To these martyrs, unified in the same God, city, and sacrifice we submit. Eternal honor to their memory. The fellow citizens, that's at the bottom.
And I'll just add this also, Olga, because it's a great question. So Tarnów is a model. It's cited as a model town for Jewish heritage preservation in Poland. And even without a current Jewish population, the city invests in conservation, memorials, and education as a way to embrace its past. And also, you should know that the Jewish cemetery that we saw the video of, because it's not easily accessible on this walk, but we wanted to show it, it has over 11,000 gravestones dating back 400 years. And yes, it is maintained and open to visitors. But the big thing is symbolic value. Unlike big centers such as Warsaw or Krakow, Tarnów is a medium-sized town that lost nearly, as we've heard, half its population in the Holocaust. And by investing in remembrance, Tarnów demonstrates that even smaller towns in Poland can lead in heritage preservation, not just the capitals, which is one of the reasons that we selected this for this group. Because can you imagine all the medium-sized and the small-sized towns in Poland following this type of model that Tarnów has done, really embracing this, and so seeing it the way it does? And this is really so important for preserving Jewish heritage. I mean, it is critical, and it is something that is quite amazing. So we are over our hour. I apologize that we went a bit over it. My apologies. I know some had to drop off, but I think it was really important to see some of these things that that Olga was showing us at the end as well. I know there are other questions that came up a lot at the end. I'm so sorry we can't get to all of them, but if you do send them to me, sblack@wowzitude.com, I will relay them to Olga, and I will try to get as many answers to your questions. Again, it's S as in Susan, S Black, BLACK, @wowzitude.com, and we will get those to Olga and answer as many questions as we can if we were not able to get there. So Gila, over to you. I know we ran over, but what an incredible tour, and how much knowledge and history in just over the hour we spent together.
Thank you